I was almost 30 years old and at the pinnacle of my physical condition. It was the turn of the century, that's what I call early 1980s, and I had no problem moving furniture. For some, I might have looked like an ant carrying 5 times my weight, but unbeknownst to anyone, I had a secret. I learned to maneuver objects without hurting myself, even with the heaviest pieces. A few months later, my supervisor asked me to take a laundry detergent container to the second floor. After all my previous training, my ego quickly said yes, and I rolled the somewhat heavy cylindrical container to the edge of the stairway. I peered up the 20 towering steps before me and reviewed my options. Not wanting to damage the cardboard container, I opted to pick the thing up and carry it up the severe incline. To this day, I can remember the stress and strain on my entire body as I made the quest toward the far-away landing at the top. Of all the strenuous stunts I had performed, none stood out more than the stupidity of that day. This was the antic that pushed me toward the dreaded consequence called the hernia.
Subscribe.
By the latter part of 1984, I was happily married. My wife and I had a bouncing baby girl who was a joy to keep up with. But there was another addition to my life. I began to feel a slight bump-type swelling between the lower left side of my abdomen and my upper thigh. It would come and go, and I tried not to give it much thought. Isn't it grand how the male ego works when you feel indestructible? What could go wrong? What was going wrong was the swelling was becoming more regular, and it mainly occurred when I was standing. My uneducated theory was that while in that position, the blood would rush to the area and not recede until I lied down or used my finger to push the little bump back into its tiny home.
Do I bother you?
Odd as it sounds, I became a master at doing this unique maneuver through my pants pocket. I had decided not to share this embarrassment with anyone, hoping that this particular swelling in my groin area would disappear. This self-denial seemed to work fine until that dreaded day in October when the Hernia Demons finally caught up with me. I had gotten a job as a group home manager, and I was determined to make a good impression, even though I had to take 3 trains and a city bus and then walk 10 blocks to get there. I'd just gotten off the D train at 59th Street and stood on the subway platform waiting to take the number 7 train to Queens. My left hand pressed the little bump through my trusty pocket, but it didn't seem to make a difference. There was no denying it. I was beginning to be in a lot of pain. The windy rush of the arriving train cooled me as it pulled into the station, and I said a silent prayer. God answered this particular prayer, and I quickly got a seat. I thought this would relieve some of the stress, but sweat began to run down my forehead as I sat there with my hand in my pocket. The biting agony would not recede. What lay ahead was the pain following me to the next train, the bumpy bus ride, and then the long, agonizing walk to my job. I suddenly had no choice. I got off the train at the next stop and began the excruciating trek to take the 2 trains necessary to get me back home. This was 1984, before the widespread convenience of cell phones. So when my wife heard me come through the door, she was more than a little curious about what I was doing home. I bypassed her and her questions and made a beeline for the bedroom. With my knees up, I lie supine on the bed for the first time in a few hours. Only then did I finally feel some relief as the swelling slowly disappeared. Mr. Macho had no choice but to spill his guts about what I had been going through for the last few months. She called our family doctor, who gave her the number of a specialist. Over the phone, the doc said what I described sounded like an inguinal hernia. The strain on the groin probably caused the problem. Fat or a piece of the small intestine pushes downward through a weakened space into the groin area. Inguinal hernias are often painful and could become strangulated. This is when blood flow to the affected area is compromised. That could be life-threatening, so surgery was in order whether I liked it or not.